Heroin Heroine. I stopped the taxi in the place du tertre. We wanted to walk along the edge of the butte and let our gare, our gaze wander over Paris. The night was delicious. Nowhere but in Paris does one experience that soft, suave hush. The heat is dry, the air is light. It is quite unlike anything one ever gets in England. A very gentle breeze, to which our fancy attributed the redolence of the south, streamed up from the Seine. Paris itself was a blur of misty blue. The Pantheon and the Eiffel Tower leapt from its folds. They seemed like symbols of the history of mankind, the noble, solid past, and the mechanical, efficient future. I leant upon the parapet, entranced. Lou's arm was around my neck. We were so still that I could feel her pulses softly beating. Great Scott, Pendragon! For all its suggestion of surprise, the voice was low and winsome. I looked around. Had I been asked, I should have said, no doubt, that I should have resented any disturbance. And here was a sudden, violent, unpleasant disturbance, and it did not disturb me. There was a somewhat tentative smile on the face of the man who had spoken. I recognized him instantly, though I had not seen him since we were at school together. The man's name was Auguin Feckless. He had been in the mathematical sixth when I was in the lower school. In my third term, he had become head perfect. He had won a scholarship at Oxford, one of the best things going. Then, without a moment's warning, he had disappeared from the school. Very few people knew why, and those who did pretended not to. But he never went to Oxford. I'd only heard of the man once since. It was in the club. His name came up in connection with some vague gossip about some crooked financial affair. I had it in my mind, vaguely enough, that must have had something to do with the trouble at school. He was not the sort of boy to be expelled for any of the ordinary reasons. It was certainly something to do with the subtlety of his intellect. To tell you the truth, he had been a sort of hero of mine at school. He possessed all the qualities I most admired, and lacked, in the fullest expansion. I had known him very slightly, but his disappearance had been a great shock. It had stuck in my mind when many more important things had left no trace. He had hardly changed from when I had last seen him. Of middle height, he had a long and rather narrow face. There was a touch of the ecclesiastic in his expression. His eyes were small and gray. He had a trick of blinking. The nose was long and beaked like Wellington's. The mouth was thin and tense. The skin was fresh and rosy. He had not developed even the tiniest wrinkle. He kept the old, uneasy, nervous movement which had been so singular in him as a boy. One would have said that he was constantly on the alert, expecting something to happen, and yet the last thing that any one could have said about him was that he was ill at ease. He possessed superb confidence. Before I had finished recognizing him, he had shaken hands with me and was prating about the old days. I hear you're Sir Peter now, by the way, he said. Good for you. I always picked you for a winner. I think I've met you, interrupted Lou. Surely it's Mr. Feckless. Oh, yes, I remember you quite well, Miss Lalaham, isn't it? Please, let's forget the past, smiled Lou, taking my arm. I don't know why I should have felt embarrassed at explaining that we were married. Feckless rattled off a string of congratulations. May I introduce Mademoiselle Hedy Namaru? The girl sat beside him and smiled and bowed. Hadid Namaru, or Lamarux, do you pronounce the X at the end? Was a brilliant brunette with a flashing smile and eyes with pupils like pinpoints. She was a mass of charming contradictions. The nose and mouth suggested more than a trace of Semitic blood, but the wedge-shaped contour of the face betokened some very opposite strain. Her cheeks were hollow, and crow's feet marred the corners of her eyes. Dark purple rims suggested sensual indulgence, pushed to the point of weariness. Though her hair was luxuriant, the eyebrows were almost non-existent. She had penciled, fine black arches above them. She was heavily and clumsily painted. She wore a loose and rather daring evening dress of blue with silver sequins and a yellow sash spotted with black. Over this she had thrown a cloak of black lace, garnished with vermilion tassels. Her hands were deathly thin. There was something obscene in the crookedness of her fingers, which were covered with enormous rings of sapphires and diamonds. Her manner was one of vivid languor. It seemed as if she always had to be startled into action, and that the instant the first stimulus had passed, she relapsed into her own deep thoughts. Her cordiality was affection, an obvious affectation, but both Lou and myself, as we shook hands, were aware of a subtle and mysterious sympathy which left behind it a strain of inexpressible evil. I also felt sure that Feckless understood this unspoken communion, and that for some reason or another it pleased him immensely. His manner changed to one of peculiarly insinuating difference, and I felt that he was something taking command of the party when he said, "May I venture to suggest that you and Lady Pendragon take supper with us at the Petite Savoyard?" Hetty slipped her arm into mine, and Lou led the way with Feckless. We were going there ourselves, she told him, and it will be perfectly delightful to be with friends. I see you're quite an old friend of my husband's. He began to tell her of the old school, as if by accident he gave an account of the circumstances which had led to his leaving. My old man was in the city, you know, I heard him say, and he dropped his pile somewhere in Lombard Street. He gave a false little laugh where he couldn't pick it up, so that was the end of my academic career. He persuaded old Rosenbaum, the banker, that I had certain talent for finance, and got me a job as a private secretary. I really did take to it like a duck to water. The things have gone very well for me ever since, but London isn't the place for men with real ambition. It doesn't afford the scope. It's either Paris or New York, for yours sincerely, Elgin Feckless. I don't know why I didn't believe a word of the tale, but I didn't. The heroine was working beautifully. I hadn't the slightest inclination to talk to Haidee. In the same way, she took no notice of me. She never uttered a word. Sometimes opiates don't actually seem to relieve problems. They just make people not care about the problems, so that, the pain and whatnot is still sort of the same. But Lou was in the same condition. She was apparently listening to what Feckless was saying, but she made no remark and preserved a total detachment. The whole scene had not taken 3 minutes. We reached the Petite Savoyard and took our seats. The patron appeared to know our friends very well. He welcomed them with even more than the usual French fussiness. We sat down by the window. The restaurant overhangs the steep slopes of the Montmartre like an eyrie. We ordered supper. Feckless with bright intelligence, the rest of us with utter listlessness. I looked at Lou across the table. I had never seen the woman before in my life. She meant nothing whatever to me. I felt a sudden, urgent desire to drink a great deal of water. I couldn't trouble to pour myself out a glass. I couldn't trouble to call the waiter. But I think I must have said the word water, for Haidee filled my goblet. A smile wriggled across her face. It was the first sign of life she had given. Even the shaking hands had been in the nature of a mechanical reflex rather than a voluntary action. There was something sinister and disquieting in her gesture. It was as if she had the aftertaste in her mouth of some abominable bitterness. I looked across at Lou. I saw she had changed color. She had looked dreadfully ill. It mattered nothing to me. I had a little amusing cycle of thoughts on the subject. I remembered that I loved her passionately. At the same time, she happened not to exist. My indifference was a source of what I can only call diabolical beatitude. It occurred to me, as a sort of joke, that she might have poisoned herself. I was certainly feeling very unwell. That didn't disturb me either. Yeah, getting drunk with opiates is not a good idea. The waiter brought a bowl of mussels. We ate them dreamily. It was part of the day's work. We enjoyed them because they were enjoyable, but nothing mattered, not even enjoyment. It struck me as strange that Haidee was simply pretending to eat, but I attributed this to preoccupation. I felt very much better. Feckless talked easily and lightly about various matters of no importance. Nobody took any notice. He did not appear to observe for his own part any lack of politeness. I certainly was feeling tired. I thought the Chamberlain would pick me up, and swallowed a couple of glasses. Lou kept on looking up at me with a sort of anxiety, as if she wanted advice of some kind, and I didn't know how to ask for it. It was rather amusing. We started the entry. Lou got suddenly up from her seat. Feckless, with pretended alarm on his face, followed her hastily. I saw the waiter had hold of her other arm. It was really very amusing. That's always the way with girls. You know, they're referring to women, right? They never know what's enough. And I then realized with startling suddenness that the case was not confined to the frailer sex. I got out just in time. If I pass over in silence the events of the next hour, it is not because of the paucity of the incident. At its conclusion, we were seated once more at the table. We took little sips of very old Armagnac. It pulled us together, but all the virtue had gone out of us. We might have been convalescents from some very long, and a wasting illness. There's nothing to be alarmed about, said Feckless, with his curious little laugh, a trifling indiscretion. I winced at the word. It took me back to King Lammas. I hated that fellow more than ever. He had begun to obsess me. Confound him. Lou had confided the whole story to our host, who admitted that he was familiar with these matters. You see, my dear Sir Peter, he said, you can't take H like you can C. And when you mix your drinks, there's the devil to pay. It's like everything else in life. You've got to find out your limit. It's very dangerous to move about when you're working H, R, M, and it's almost certain disaster to eat. I must admit, I felt an awful fool. After all, I had studied medicine pretty seriously, and this was the second time that a layman had read me the riot act. But Lou nodded cheerfully enough. That brandy had brought back the color in her cheeks. Yes, she said, I'd heard that all before. But, you know, it's one thing to hear a thing and another to go through it yourself. Experience is the only teacher, admitted Feckless. All these things are perfectly all right, but the main thing is to go slow at first and give yourself a chance to learn the ropes. All this time, Haidee had been sitting there like a statue. She exhaled a very curious atmosphere. There was a certain fascination in her complete lack of fascination. Please excuse this paradoxical way of putting it. I mean that she had all the qualities which normally attract. She had the remnants of an astonishing, if bizarre, beauty. She had obviously a vast wealth of experience. She possessed a quiet intensity which should have made her irresistible, and yet she was absolutely devoid of what we call magnetism. It isn't a scientific word so much the worse for science. It describes a fact in nature, and that one of the most important facts in practical affairs, everything of human interest, from muscle hall turns to empires, is run on magnetism and is very little else. And science ignores it because it can't be measured by mechanical instruments. Well, there's different types of science, are there? The whole of the woman's vitality was directed to some secret interior shrine of her own soul. Now she began to speak for the first time. The only subject that interested her in this wide universe was heroin. Her voice was monotonous, like so many grunge singers. Lou told me later that it reminded her of a dirge droned by Tibetan monks far off across implacable snow. The whole, you know, are the Mongolians and Siberians and stuff too, right? It's the only thing there is, she said, in a tone of extraordinary, ecstatic detachment. One could divine an infinite, unholy joy derived from its own sadness. It was as if she took a morbid pleasure in being something melancholy, something monstrous. There was, in fact, a kind of martyred majesty in her mood. Yet you also hear a lot of, well, particularly the using of adulterated drugs, but you hear certain types of drug addicts refer to themselves as monsters, or. You mustn't expect to get the result at once, she went on. You have to be born into it, married with it, and dead from it before you can understand it. Different people are different, but it always takes some months at least before you get rid of that stupid nuisance. Life. As long as you have animal passions, you are an animal. How disgusting it is to think of eating and loving and all those appetites like cattle. Breathing itself would be beastly if one knew one were doing it. How intolerable life would be to people of even mediocre refinement. if they were always acutely conscious of the process of digestion. Now, some people, they find their bliss and they go beyond the disgust of that with all that, but she gave a little shiver. You've read the Mystics, Sir Peter, interrupted Feclis. I'm afraid not, my dear man, I replied. Fact is, I haven't read anything much, unless I had to. I went into it, rather, for a couple years, he returned. Then he stopped short and flushed. The thought had apparently called up some very unpleasant memories. He tried to cover his confusion by volubility, and began to elaborate exposition of the tenets of Saint Teresa, Miguel de Molinas, and several others celebrated in that line. The main point, you see, he recapitulated finally, is that the theory that everything human in us is before all things an obstacle in the way of holiness. That is the secret of the saints, that they renounce everything for one thing, which they call the divine purity. It is not simply those things which we ordinarily call sins or vices those are merely the elementary forms of iniquity, exuberant grossness. The real difficulty hardly begins till things of that sort are dismissed forever. On the road to saintship, every bodily or mental manifestation is in itself a sin, even when it is something which ordinary piety would class as a virtue. Haydée here has got the same idea. And I've recently, I'm working on a lecture, I guess, that includes the idea that, well, it's not the body and the mind, and you really can't shut that off, and you really don't blame the body and the mind, but you control the body and the mind, and you turn these desires towards the divine service. She nodded serenely. I had no idea, she said, that those people had got so much sense. I've always thought of them as tangled up with religious ideas. I understand now, yes, it's the life of holiness. If you have to go to the trouble of putting it in the terms of morality, as I suppose you English people have to, I feel that contact of any sort, even with myself, contaminates me. I was the chief of sinners in my time, in the English sense of the word. Now I've forgotten what love means, except for a faint sense of nausea when it comes under my notice. I hardly eat at all. It's only brutes that want to wallow in action, that need 3 meals a day. I hardly ever talk. Words seem such waste, and they are none of them true. No one has yet invented a language from my point of view, human life or heroin life. I've tried them both, and I don't regret having chosen as I did. I said something about heroin shortening life. A wan smile flickered on her hollow cheeks. There was something appalling in its wintry splendor. It silenced us. Well, actually, the drinking and smoking back then, when the drugs were pure, would shorten the life more so. But yeah, you can kind of expect about 10 years off one's life through, She looked down at her hands. I noticed for the first time with extreme surprise that they were extraordinarily dirty. She explained her smile. Of course, if you count time by years, you're very likely right. But what have the calculations of the astronomers to do with the life of the soul? Before I started heroin, year followed year, and nothing worthwhile happened. It was like a child scribbling in a ledger. Now that I've gotten into the heroin life, a minute or hour, I don't know which, and I don't care, contains more real life than any 5 years period in my unregenerate days. You talk of death. Why shouldn't you? It's perfectly all right for you. You animals have got to die, and you know it, but I am very far from sure that I shall ever die, and I'm as indifferent to the idea as I am to any other of your monkey ideas. She relapsed into silence, leaned back, and closed her eyes once more. She relapsed into silence. Oh, I make no claim to be a philosopher of any kind, but it was quite evident to the most ordinary common sense that her position was unassailable if anyone chose to take it. As G.K. Chesterton says, you cannot argue with the choice of the soul. It often has been argued, in fact, that mankind lost the happiness characteristic of his fellow animals when he acquired self-consciousness. This is, in fact, the meaning of the legend of the fall. We have become as gods, knowing good and evil. And the price is that we live by labor and, in his eyes, foreknowledge of death. Feckless caught my thought. He quoted with slow emphasis. He weaves and is clothed with derision, sows and he shall not reap. His life is a watch or a vision, between asleep and asleep. He thought of the great Victorian seemed the thought of the great Victorian seemed to chill him. He threw off his depression, lighting a cigarette and taking a strong pull at his brandy. Haydée, he said, with assumed lightness, lives in open sin with a person named Baruch de Espinosa. I think it's Schopenhauer who calls him Der Gottbedrunkenemann, the God-intoxicated man, murmured Lou faintly, shooting a sleepy glance at Haydée from beneath her heavy, blue-veined eyelids. Yes, went on Feckless. She always carries about one of his books. She goes to sleep on his words, and when her eyes open, they fall upon the page. He tapped the table as he spoke. His quick intuition had understood that this strange incident was disquieting to us. He wriggled his thumb and forefinger in the air towards the waiter. The man interrupted the gesture as a request for the bill and went off to get it. Let me drive you and Sir Peter back to your hotel, said our host to Lou. You've had a rather rough time. I prescribe a good night's rest. You'll find a dose of H, a very useful pick-me-up in the morning. But for heaven's sake, don't flog a willing horse. Just the minutest sniff, and then coke up gradually when you begin to feel like getting up. By lunchtime, you'll be feeling like a couple of 2-year-olds. He paid the bill and went out. As luck would have it, a taxi had just discharged a party at the door. So we drove home without any trouble. Lou and I both felt absolutely washed out. She lay upon my breast and held my hand. I felt my strength come back to me when it was called on to support her weakness, and our love grew up anew out of that waste of windy darkness. I felt myself completely purged of all passion, and in that lustration we were baptized anew and christened with the name of love. But although nature had done her best to get rid of the excess of the poison we had taken, there remained a residual effect. We had arrived at the hotel very weary, though as a matter of course we had insisted on Feckless and Haydée coming upstairs for a final drink, but we could hardly keep our eyes open, and as soon as they were gone we made all possible haste to get between the sheets of the twin beds. I need hardly tell my married friends that on previous nights the process of going to bed had been a very elaborate ritual, but on this occasion it was a mere attempt to break the record for speed. Within 5 minutes from the departure of Feclis and Haiti, the lights were out. I'd imagined that I should drop off to sleep instantly. In fact, it took me some time to realize that I had not done so. I was in an aesthetic condition, which is hard to distinguish from dreaming. In fact, if one started to lay down definitions and explained the differences, the further one got, the more obscure would be the controversy would become. But my eyes were certainly wide open, and I was lying on my back, whereas I can never sleep except on my right side, or else, strangely enough, in a sitting position, and the thoughts began to make themselves more conscious as I lay. You know how thoughts fade out imperceptibly as one goes to sleep? Well, here they were, fading in. I found myself practically deprived of volition on the physical plane. It was as if it had become impossible for me to wish to move or to speak. I was bathed in an ocean of exceeding calm. My mind was very active, but only so, within peculiar limits. I did not seem to be directing the current of my thoughts. In an ordinary way, that fact would have annoyed me intensely, but now it merely made me curious. I tried as an experiment to fix my mind on something definite. I was technically able to do so, but at the same time I was aware that I considered the effort not worth making. I noticed, too, that my thoughts were uniformly pleasant. Curiosity impelled me to fix my mind on ideas which are normally the source of irritation and worry. There was no difficulty in doing so, but the bitterness had disappointed. I went over incidents in the past which I had almost forgotten by virtue of that singular mental process which protects the mind from annoyance. I discovered that this loss of memory was apparent and not real. I recollected every detail with the most minute exactitude, but the most vexatious and humiliating items meant nothing to me any more. I took the same pleasure in recalling them as one has in reading a melancholy tale. I may almost go so far as to say that the unpleasant incidents were preferable to others. The reason is, I think, that they leave a deeper mark on the mind. Our souls have invented our minds, so to speak, with the object of registering conscious experiences, and therefore the more deeply an experience is felt, the better our minds are carrying out the intentions of our souls. Forsitan hac olim meminiasa juvabit, says Aeneas in Virgil when recounting his hardships. Quaint, by the way, I haven't thought of a Latin tag a dozen times since I left school. Drugs, like old age, strip off one's recent memories and leave bare one's forgotten ideas, which can make them horrible with dealing with trauma. The most deeply seated instinct in us is our craving for experience, and that is why the efforts of the utopians to make life a pleasant routine always arose subconscious revolt in the spirit of man. It was the progressive prosperity of the Victorian age that caused the Great War. It was the reaction of the schoolboy against the abolition of adventure. This curious condition of mind possessed an internal quality. The stream of thoughts flowed through my brain like a vast, irresistible river. I felt that nothing could ever stop it or even change the current in any important respect. My consciousness had something of the quality of a fixed star receding through space by right of its eternal destiny, and the stream carried me on from one set of thoughts to another slowly and without stress. It was like a hushed symphony. A hushed symphony. It included all possible memories, changing imperceptibly from one to another without the faintest hint of jarring. I was struck of the flight of time because a church clock struck somewhere far off at immense, incalculable intervals. I knew, therefore, that I was making a white night of it. I was aware of the dawn through the open French windows on the balcony. Long ages later, there was a chime of bells announcing early mass, and gradually my thought became more slow, more dim. The active pleasure of thinking became passive. Little by little, the shadows crept across my reverie, and then I knew no more. And so, what about achieving these states without the drugs? Well, we have this area here, and we have, in between here. I mean, the nose kind of extends back, so, kind of just behind what people typically think of the nose. And let me move to the diary portion. So we're in. Okay, let me. Sunday, the 17th of May, 2009. A rose scent offering representing clairvoyance. Enochian key 29. In the hematite stone, the reflection of the room that occupied the upper half of the side I was looking at went white. I felt as if I were made up of little holes, as we all are. The lower half I don't know where I lost signal, so let me start again. The 29th or the 19th Enochian key, 2 to 2:09 p.m. Sunday the 17th. In the hematite stone, the reflection of the room that occupied the upper half of the side I was looking at went white. I felt as if I were made up of little holes, as we all are. The lower half, the half where I and the oath, that Enochian tablet, were reflected, turned into the side of a ceremonial blade, thinking black as it was, shaped like that. The bottom of the blade was a color like a lava. It flowed in color like a lava lamp or something like that, but with psychedelic knobs of color. I also, during dusk, in the second to fourth bow, ending during the sitting, saw an aventurine stone glowing in my prayer space. It glowed with the brightness of one of those bulbs. Can't read that. This was not nearly as bright as the sapphire and the aquamarine stone I mentioned recently. 4:10 to 4:23 p.m., the bottom half of the hematite went clear, and the usual psychedelic stuff that I experienced and meditation followed. Or went out. I discoursed with the next door neighbor upon eschatology, glossolalia,
Green living. I don't mean the Green New Deal or some sort of mislabeled thing, but Monday the 18th, I watched A Brief History of Disbelief. Let's Interreligious World, March, April 2009. The preface to 66, the Holy Quran Arabic text, English translation and commentary, Maulana Muhammad Ali Ahmadiyya and Juman Ishat, Islam, Lahore Incorporated. That green one I shared the 1 year. Not sure which year at this point. Sleep CD on Apagani Surah 20. Enochian Key 29. Author 25. 1:21 to 1:36 p.m. and 3:49 to 4:01 p.m. I found myself in much. I heard low and animal noises. What they were, I know not, but to stay calm with the noise was a difficulty. A rose scent offering representing compassion, 7:50 to 8:16 p.m. Same meditation, I guess. Tuesday the 19th, I watched Sufism's Contribution to Planetary Culture, Pir Zia Inayat Khan. The storm that caused the disruption is messing with the phone, so it's probably going to give out again. The Secret Behind the Secret, Abraham and who was it? And I watched the features to that program, to that, I borrowed the DVD, I guess. I read Seduction Messenger, May 2009. Secrets of the Dead, The Tomb of Christ, 2:38 to 3:40 p.m. The 19th Enochian Key, the 24th author. I listened to